The dense forest stretched endlessly, its towering pines swaying under the soft whisper of the evening breeze. Deep within, where the wild ruled and nature's voice was the loudest, a woman sat curled against the rough bark of an ancient oak. Her clothes, torn and dirt-streaked, clung to her shivering frame. She had been left behind, abandoned in the middle of nowhere with no way to navigate the unyielding wilderness. Tears blurred her vision as she replayed the moment over and over again. One moment, she was walking hand in hand with the man she trusted, believing in the warmth of his presence. The next, he was gone. No explanation, no remorse, just the sound of his retreating footsteps fading into the depths of the woods. She was alone, or so she thought. The rustling of leaves nearby sent a jolt of fear through her weakened body. Her breath hitched as she struggled to make sense of the dark figure moving in the underbrush. Then, it stepped into the fading light. A massive bear, its deep brown fur dusted with the last golden rays of the sun. Its powerful form was both majestic and terrifying. Instinct told her to flee, but where? Every direction was an abyss of trees, and she was in no shape to run. Instead, she shut her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But the bear didn't attack. It didn't roar, it didn't charge. Instead, it lingered, its dark eyes locked onto hers, studying her. There was something almost knowing in its gaze, something that defied the primal fear pounding in her chest. And then, the most unexpected thing happened. The woman's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she remained frozen against the tree, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bear took a step closer, its massive paws pressing silently into the damp earth. Its breath, warm and laced with the scent of the forest, curled into the cool night air. She braced herself, expecting the worst. But then, something astonishing happened. The bear lowered itself onto all fours, its head tilting slightly as if trying to understand her fear. It did not snarl. It did not lunge. Instead, it let out a deep, rumbling exhale, less a growl, more a sigh of recognition. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, it backed away and settled onto the ground a few feet from her. It was as if the creature had decided she was no threat. Tears welled in her eyes. Was she hallucinating? Could this beast, a creature feared by many, actually be protecting her? The night dragged on, the forest alive with distant sounds, the hoot of an owl, the scuttling of unseen critters, but the bear remained. It kept its watchful eyes on her, occasionally shifting but never leaving. Exhausted, the woman eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning light filtered through the trees, painting golden patches on the forest floor. A distant sound, faint at first, then growing, stirred her awake. It was the unmistakable rumble of an approaching vehicle. Hope surged through her. She struggled to her feet, her body stiff and aching, and opened her mouth to call out. But before she could utter a sound, the bear let out a deep, resonant huff and stood up. It turned its head toward the direction of the sound, its ears twitching. Moments later, a shout echoed through the trees. "Over here, I see something." Two figures emerged through the foliage, both clad in ranger uniforms, their boots crunching against the twigs and fallen leaves. One of them, a tall man with a rugged face and piercing green eyes, froze in his tracks the moment he spotted the bear. His hand instinctively moved to his belt, where a radio and bear spray dangled. "Stay back," he warned. But the woman, weak as she was, lifted a trembling hand. "No, wait," she croaked. The second rescuer, a woman with short-cropped brown hair and an air of quiet authority, studied the scene with narrowed eyes. She had seen many wild animals before, some aggressive, some frightened, some curious. But never had she seen a bear simply stand guard over a human. The bear huffed again, then, as if sensing that its job was done, turned and lumbered away into the trees. Within moments, it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The rangers rushed forward, their concern now fully focused on the woman. "Are you hurt?" the female ranger asked, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Not badly," she murmured, her eyes still on the spot where the bear had disappeared. The male ranger exchanged a glance with his partner. "That was incredible," he muttered. "That bear didn't attack you?" The woman shook her head. "No, it stayed with me all night. It protected me." The female ranger knelt beside her, pulling out a water bottle and handing it over. "You're lucky," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't have survived the night out here alone. But that bear, it didn't see you as a threat. Maybe it even saw you as something to protect." Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she took a sip of water. "I don't know why it did what it did," she whispered, "but it saved my life." The male ranger exhaled, shaking his head in amazement. "Nature always has a way of surprising us," he said. "Let's get you out of here." As they led her toward their truck, she cast one last glance over her shoulder, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that she'd see the bear again. But the forest was silent. And yet, somehow, she knew, she hadn't been abandoned after all. The woman never expected to see the bear again. After her rescue, she was taken to a small town on the edge of the forest, where she spent days recovering. The ordeal had left her physically drained, but something else lingered in her mind, something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the fear of what had happened. It was the memory of the bear, the way it had stayed by her side, as if it understood her pain. Days turned into weeks, and though life returned to normal, she found herself drawn back to the woods. She needed to know, had it all been a strange trick of fate, or had there truly been a connection between them? One crisp morning, she packed a small bag with supplies and set out on a familiar trail near the area where she had been found. She walked carefully, listening to the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of birds. And then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw it. The bear. It stood a few yards away, its massive form framed by the trees. A rush of emotions hit her all at once. Fear, awe, relief. But this time, she didn't freeze. Instead, she knelt slowly, lowering herself to the ground in a quiet gesture of trust. The bear watched her with those deep, knowing eyes, then, after a long moment, did something she never expected. It sat down. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips. The bear remembered her, but she wasn't alone. A rustling in the underbrush caught her attention. At first, she thought it was just another forest animal, a rabbit, maybe, or a fox. But then, from the thick greenery, stepped a creature much smaller than the bear, a dog. The sight of it startled her. It was thin, its ribs faintly visible beneath a matted coat of golden fur. It looked like a stray, lost and alone, much like she had been in the forest. But what truly stunned her was that the dog wasn't afraid of the bear. In fact, it walked right up to the massive creature and, to her utter disbelief, nudged its muzzle against the bear's thick fur. The bear let out a soft chuff, almost a greeting, and lowered its head. The woman could hardly believe what she was seeing. The dog had found a companion in the most unlikely of places. At first, she hesitated. A bear and a dog. Surely, this was unnatural. But as she watched them interact, something in her heart softened. There was no fear, no aggression. Just an unspoken understanding between two creatures that had somehow, against all odds, formed a bond. Carefully, she reached in her bag and pulled out a small piece of bread she had packed for herself. She extended it toward the dog, who perked up, sniffing the air. Hesitant at first, the dog took a step forward, then another, until it was close enough to gently take the food from her hand. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. The bear watched silently, its massive frame still and patient. Then, as if deciding this meeting had gone on long enough, it stood and turned, lumbering back into the woods. The dog, however, didn't move. It looked between the retreating bear and the woman, as if torn between two worlds. And then it made its choice. Slowly, the dog padded toward her, its tail giving a tentative wag. It settled near her feet, watching her with cautious but trusting eyes. The woman reached out, running her fingers through its tangled fur. "You've been alone too, haven't you?" she murmured. The dog let out a soft whine, pressing its head into her palm. She glanced back at the forest, wondering if she'd ever see the bear again. Maybe this was the bear's way of helping once more, not by staying, but by guiding another lost soul to her. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and she smiled. Perhaps she hadn't been abandoned after all. The first few days were cautious. The dog, whom she had since started calling Rusty because of his golden coat, was hesitant at first. Though he had chosen to follow her home, he still carried the wariness of a stray, flinching at sudden movements, sleeping curled in the corner of her small cabin rather than beside her. She gave him space, offering gentle reassurance with food, water, and quiet companionship. But it was on the third night that things began to change. A storm rolled in, shaking the windows of her cabin with fierce winds. Rain pounded against the roof, and the distant rumble of thunder sent shivers down her spine. She had been sitting in her small living room, wrapped in a blanket, when she noticed Rusty trembling in the corner, his ears flat against his head. Without thinking, she patted the spot next to her. "It's okay," she murmured. For a moment, he hesitated, his instincts telling him to stay guarded. But then, as another clap of thunder rolled through the sky, he darted forward, pressing his body against her legs. She ran her fingers through his damp fur, whispering soothing words. That night, Rusty didn't sleep in the corner. He curled up right beside her. And from that moment on, he was no longer just a stray. He was hers. Rusty settled into his new life with ease, following her wherever she went. But what truly surprised her was that, despite having a warm home, he never forgot the forest. Every day, when the sun was high in the sky, he would trot toward the tree line, looking back at her expectantly. She knew what he wanted, and so, with cautious hope, she followed him back into the woods. At first, she wasn't sure if they would ever see the bear again. But on the fourth trip, just when she was starting to believe it had all been a strange, one-time connection, Rusty perked up. His tail wagged as he darted forward, disappearing through the trees. Then she saw it. The bear stood near the edge of a clearing, watching them. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Rusty ran up to the bear without hesitation, his small frame a stark contrast against the towering creature. Instead of growling or retreating, the bear let out a soft chuff, lowering its head as Rusty nudged against its massive paw. The sight was almost surreal. She took a cautious step forward. The bear's dark eyes flicked toward her, but there was no threat in them, just recognition. A silent understanding passed between them. She wasn't sure what to do, so she did the only thing that felt right. She sat down on a fallen log, watching as Rusty pranced around the bear's feet, playful and unafraid. And then, the most incredible thing happened. The bear played back. It was slow at first, a slight tilt of the head, a curious nudge of its paw. But when Rusty barked happily and leapt in a small circle, the bear, impossibly gentle for its size, lowered itself onto its belly and let out a deep, almost amused sound. It swiped a massive paw across the ground, not to harm, but to mimic the way Rusty had moved. The woman couldn't help but laugh. Over the following weeks, the bond between Rusty and the bear grew stronger. Rusty, once a skittish stray, became bold in his interactions, playfully weaving between the bear's legs or nudging it to follow him deeper into the forest. And what amazed her most was that the bear followed. It was clear the bear was learning from Rusty. It began responding to his movements, mirroring small behaviors, standing when Rusty stood, sitting when Rusty sat. One day, when Rusty rolled onto his back, basking in the sun, the bear hesitated for a moment before doing the same, stretching out on the grass beside him. She had never seen anything like it. One afternoon, as she sat beneath the shade of a tree, watching them interact, she felt something shift in her heart. She had spent so much time thinking about that night in the forest. The fear, the abandonment, the uncertainty of whether she would survive. But now, as she watched Rusty happily nuzzle the bear's side, her once-lost dog teaching a wild creature how to trust, she realized something. She had been saved that night, not just by luck, not just by the rangers. She had been saved by the bear. And in return, somehow, Rusty was saving it. With a smile, she reached into her bag and pulled out a treat for Rusty, who happily bounded over to accept it. The bear watched curiously. She hesitated. Then, cautiously, she extended her hand, palm open, toward the bear. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, so slowly it made her breath catch, the bear leaned forward. It sniffed her fingers, warm breath tickling her skin. And then, in a moment that sent warmth spreading through her chest, it nudged its massive head gently against her hand. She laughed, a tear slipping down her cheek. The bond had deepened in ways she never could have imagined. And as Rusty barked playfully, darting off with the bear in tow, she knew one thing for certain. None of them would ever be alone again. Not every day was easy. At first, the bond between Rusty and the bear seemed almost magical. Two unlikely companions navigating the wild together. But as time passed, challenges began to surface. The biggest struggle was trust. While Rusty had quickly adapted to his new life, bouncing between the safety of the woman's home and the wilderness where the bear roamed, the bear remained cautious. It never ventured too close to the cabin, always lingering at the edge of the woods, watching but never fully stepping into her world. She couldn't blame it. The bear belonged to the wild, to the vast stretches of trees and rivers. But a part of her wondered, could it ever trust her the way it trusted Rusty? One evening, a test of that trust arrived. A sudden rustling in the underbrush sent a chill down her spine as she walked the familiar forest path with Rusty trotting ahead. It was nearing dusk, the golden light filtering through the trees, when the air filled with an unmistakable, low growl. A coyote. It emerged from the shadows, lean and hungry, its yellow eyes locked onto Rusty. The dog froze, ears pinned back, his body stiff with tension. Before she could react, a massive blur of brown fur thundered between them. The bear. It placed itself between Rusty and the coyote, standing tall, its deep growl reverberating through the trees. The coyote hesitated, baring its teeth, but it was no match for the sheer size of the bear. With one final snarl, it turned tail and vanished into the underbrush. Rusty let out a small bark, as if thanking his friend. The bear huffed in return, nudging Rusty's side before turning to look at her. She swallowed the lump in her throat. This was it. This was the moment. Slowly, she stepped forward and reached out her hand, not hesitantly this time, but with confidence. The bear didn't back away. Instead, after a long pause, it lowered its great head and let her touch it. Her fingers brushed against its thick fur, warm and coarse beneath her palm. A shiver ran through her, but not from fear, from awe. The bear had protected Rusty, and in doing so, it had finally chosen to trust her. Their bond deepened after that night. Rusty no longer had to call the bear to their usual meeting spot. The bear started coming on its own. Sometimes, it would even linger near the cabin, never crossing into her space, but watching from a distance, as if keeping a silent vigil. One evening, as she sat on her porch with Rusty curled at her feet, she spotted the bear resting at the tree line. It wasn't watching her. It was just there at peace. She smiled. They had overcome fear. They had protected each other. And now, they had something deeper, understanding. The bond wasn't just unusual anymore. It was unbreakable. The first sign of danger was the scent of smoke. She had been walking the familiar path through the woods with Rusty trotting at her side, his ears perked and tail wagging, when a sharp, acrid smell filled the air. A moment later, the sky above the trees darkened, not from the setting sun, but from thick, billowing smoke curling into the sky. Her heart pounded. A wildfire. She turned, ready to run back to the cabin, but Rusty froze, his nose twitching toward the deeper part of the forest. Then, without hesitation, he took off. "Rusty, no," she called, but he was already gone. She ran after him, pushing past low branches and brambles, her breath coming in short gasps. The smoke thickened, making her cough, but she didn't stop, not when she realized where Rusty was going. To the bear. The clearing where they had spent so many afternoons was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. Flames licked at the trees on the far side, creeping closer with each passing second. And in the center of it all stood the bear, trapped between the growing fire and a thick, impassable cluster of fallen logs. Rusty barked wildly, circling in distress, but the bear hesitated, unsure of where to go. She didn't think. She acted. Without a second thought, she ran forward, waving her arms. "This way. Come on." The bear's dark eyes met hers, full of something she had never seen before: fear. It was paralyzed, the heat pressing in, the flames flickering closer. Rusty barked again, darting toward her before running back toward the bear. He did it again, and then, finally, the bear moved. It followed Rusty, its massive paws thudding against the ground as they weaved through the trees, away from the fire. Smoke stung her lungs, but she pushed forward, running until she could no longer feel the heat at her back. Only when they reached the safety of Small River did she collapse to her knees, gasping for air. Rusty trotted over and licked her face, his tail wagging furiously. And then, to her amazement, the bear did something she never could have imagined. It lowered its head and nudged her shoulder. A gesture of gratitude. A sob of relief escaped her lips as she reached up, resting her hand against its thick fur. They had made it. Together. The fire had tested their bond, but in the end, it had only proven what she already knew. This connection wasn't just chance. It was fate. The forest recovered, as it always did. Weeks after the fire, green shoots pushed through the scorched earth, and the scent of pine replaced the acrid smoke. The trees would grow again, just as life always found a way to continue. And so had they. Rusty had fully settled into his new life, no longer the wary stray he once was. He was her shadow, her companion, always trotting by her side whether she was at home or out in the woods. But he was never truly just hers, because the bear was still there, too. Though the fire had driven them to the edge of danger, it had also erased the last barriers of hesitation. The bear no longer lingered at a distance. Some mornings, she would step onto her porch and find it resting at the tree line, waiting. Other times, it would come to the river where Rusty played, watching over them with quiet, protective eyes. It never entered her world completely. It remained a creature of the wild, as it should. But the bond they shared, that was unshakable. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted through the air, she sat by the river with Rusty curled against her legs. The bear lay a few feet away, stretched out in the soft earth, its deep breaths steady and calm. She reached down, running her fingers through Rusty's thick fur, then glanced at the bear, whose massive form no longer filled her with fear. Instead, it filled her with something else, awe. Once, she had thought she had been abandoned in the forest. Now, she knew better. She had been found. By Rusty. By the bear. By a love that had crossed the boundaries of fear and instinct, forming something neither of them had expected: a family. As the sun rose higher, Rusty stood, gave a happy bark, and trotted toward the bear, nudging its leg playfully. The bear let out a deep, amused huff, and, in a moment of pure trust, lowered its great head and bumped Rusty back. She smiled. Some friendships defied explanation, but they didn't need words to understand what was already in their hearts. And so, with the wild before them and the warmth of companionship between them, they continued forward together.